Oh, good afternoon, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Okay, good afternoon, Frank. Another busy week with lots of things going on in Spain, and now America and Israel leaving UNESCO. Though I have to say, what is in my mind most is the results of the German election still, which I think we talked about to some extent last week.
A little bit.
Because refugees seem to be coming, even though the big wave of refugees is not in the headlines anymore. Nevertheless, the consequences of that wave and what was done, and the reactions to it, which of course were, I mean, Brexit was essentially a reaction to, not to the wave of refugees, but to more people moving. Angela Merkel had a very positive and humanitarian reaction to the wave of refugees, and that was not accepted by all her voters. And it seems to me that this is a mark of something that's been going on for a long time, that is part of the general problem of organization, which is becoming a bigger and bigger problem as globalization progresses. And that the way I would understand it now is that territoriality, our relationship to a particular place or a particular area, has been a very important factor of identity and organization from the beginning of our history, and still is. But it's the way we relate to territoriality is changing. And it's, as with all change, as the rate of change accelerates, the amount of resistance to it also increases.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got resistance to immigration in the United States, which is a country based on immigration. We've got the problems in the between Europe and the Middle East, and between Europe and Africa, and also the problems between Australia and Southeast Asia. And Australia is a country of immigration as well.
Right.
So it seems as though in all these cases, an increasing number of people are giving up any territoriality in search of other things that will fit them into the modern world.
Let me explore a bit what you mean by territoriality. Are you referring to the immigrants who are leaving their homelands to go to someplace new, giving up that territoriality?
I mean, in what sense will a Syrian be a Syrian if they're not in Syria?
Mm-hmm.
We expect people who are accepted into American society as new citizens to give up their sense of belonging to the territory that they came from.
Mm-hmm.
So citizenship is a factor of the organization of the world in terms of nation states, and one of the principles of it is that you belong to a particular territory and you have a passport to demonstrate it and you have a place there.
Mm-hmm.
But long before the idea of nation states, people identified themselves in terms of territory, even though there was no such thing as citizenship as we understand it today, and there were no boundaries.
Right.
People could travel freely, but nevertheless, I mean, I've noticed this as when I was living in Iran, that Iranians identify themselves according to what part of Iran they come from. And that's works well in Iran better than a lot of countries, simply because Iran is essentially an arid, large arid territory, and it's very important where you get the water from, and it's the centers of water availability that become the places that people identify themselves with.
It's interesting because the territoriality discussion, I think, can almost apply inversely to the people who already are living in the country that are being inundated by waves of immigrants. Right?
Yeah,
and that's what I thought you meant initially, but obviously the way you described it, I understand it now. Because what happens is,
well, I think that after all, there's been a history of immigration into America, which has continued, and the problem now is that it's increasing, and people don't want it to increase, or some people don't.
Yeah, and that I think is that's a trend that we've seen now across the whole world, right? As you just mentioned, and I hate to reduce it to something like this, but I think it boils down to one of the most basic of all elements. It's a sense of fear and prospective dispossession on the part of people who are already in the United States or in Germany or in Australia, who don't want to see tax dollars expended when in fact they think that those funds should be better spent on them. And it becomes a very distasteful, greedy kind of scenario that unfolds. And
well, it's certainly partly that, but it's also partly the cultural problem. People want to interact with people who know how to interact with them, people who have the same sense of social order as they do. And you can assimilate a small percentage of people who aren't like that, but when the percentage rises, it causes trouble. But I think that, and I have been expecting this for a long time, but not seen so much evidence for it, that as the population continues to increase and we continue to extend our arenas of social interaction so that we're interacting with larger and larger numbers of people, we start to move more, and in a global society, presumably the global economy is going to work very differently from national economies, and people are going to have to move around much more in order to find work, because the different natural resources will be the basis of new economic endeavors. Then gradually, we're going to have to get used to the idea that belonging to society doesn't necessarily mean having a particular place in a particular territory. But that's going to be a very different sort of human society from what we're used to.
Well, let me ask the obvious question then. All right, if you look at the Brexit vote and you look at the expected Austrian vote this weekend, which is going to presumably shift to the right a little bit. You look at the rise of the right-wing parties in the German vote, and you look at the rise of Trump in the United States. What's going on? If it is, as you say, inevitable, and I agree with you, that as more people get in increasing contact with each other and they begin to follow the global economy, a lot of these perceived emotional barriers are going to drop, and people are actually going to be able to interact. Are we seeing the last gasps of anti-globalization, or is this
we're seeing resistance to change. I'm sure it's not the last gasp. There'll always be resistance to change, but the resistance to this particular factor of change, I think, will diminish after a while, as more and more people start to move, or find themselves moving for various reasons.
I think it's potentially a potential accelerant, I believe, because I think just as this manifestation of anti-globalization on all those aforementioned examples, I think have run a pretty extreme course. I mean, if we were to sit around 4 years ago and take bets on Britain leaving the EU or Donald Trump becoming the president, nobody would have bet on these things. But these things have happened. And I think what's in turn happening now is there's a bit of a backlash going on. And there's almost a reawakening of people who had taken globalization for granted and now are like, wait a minute, actually, we can't take it for granted. There are things that could be happening that might imperil the free flow of information and exchange of ideas with the rest of the world. And that could be a good thing in the even medium term, not even just the long term.
Well, I think globalization became a paradigm in the 1990s, and nobody knew what it meant. But after the collapse of the Soviet, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, up until that time we'd been seeing the world as bipolar. Mm-hmm. And then to begin with, we replaced that with unipolar, but that didn't seem to be working. And then globalization gradually came to be the way everybody thought of the world, that it was becoming a global community.
Right.
But nobody knew what it meant. And the number of books published with globalization in the title skyrocketed in the second half of the 90s, and in fact in the past decade. But they still don't really explain what they're talking about. They focus on something that they think has to do with globalization and do an analytical description of that. So it's the globalization is the paradigm that we use for thinking about the world without having an actual definition for it. Simply because there's nothing else in the world at the moment that anybody can think of that actually represents the way the world is organized or changing.
Well, I don't disagree with that, but I harken back to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, who, when asked about his definition of obscenity, when he was being questioned after participating in an opinion in the Supreme Court, says, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And this is almost what's happening now. I mean, you're seeing young people who are in their 40s and 30s and 20s who I think are frankly beginning to get concerned at what is unfolding in front of them. And I think it's going to have an effect. I mean, if you go back to the example you were talking about with Iran, what if you had three villages fairly widely spaced apart from each other, but they were sharing a common well? And then the villagers were exchanging ideas and maybe making the wrong kinds of friendships. And some village leaders said, okay, from now on, we're only going to send so-and-so people to the well, so there's no exchange with villages B and C and D. I mean, how long does that last? That doesn't last for very long.
I haven't actually been able to wander about Iran for a couple of decades now, but I would think that what is going on is that the technology of access to water is changing.
Of course, I use that only as an example.
In ways that are and as the technology changes, the organization of access changes, and because of the way Iran has come together as a country and is related more and more to what's going on in other countries, that takes that into account.
Look, can I speak a little bit about Iran before we finish? I feel very badly for the Iranians. The Iranians, I think, moved heaven and earth.
That's un-American.
Well, I don't care. They moved heaven and earth to get to some internal consensus there to agree to that nuclear deal. And by all accounts, including the U.S. military, they're complying with the deal. And then now what's going to happen is Trump is going to decertify them and throw them to Congress, which is about as dysfunctional as God knows what. And it's going to imperil the whole arrangement. And
not only is the U.S. military saying that it's a good arrangement and it's working, but the Israeli military is saying it's a good arrangement and it's working. And it's only Trump and I think Netanyahu who keep talking against it. And if Trump won't recertify it on the date, I'm not sure what the date is when he has to do that, then it will go to Congress, and I don't know what will happen in Congress.
I would bet not very much. So
No.
I think they have the option of, well, what I read today is that they wish to engage with Trump to find out what they need to do in order to make the treaty more palatable to him. And of course, Trump has no specifics naturally. So it's likely that it could expire, and the United States will end up out of the deal, which means that the deal will collapse because the French and the British and the English and the Chinese and the Russians have indicated they're not going to remain party to the deal.
No, the Europeans, I think, are going to stick with it.
Well, I guess my point is that I feel badly for the Iranians because if the United States ends up somehow reimposing sanctions on them as a result of this charade, I think it's going to be a disastrous event.
It's amazing how well the Iranians did under the sanctions before. And now, of course, the US is threatening to add the what are they called? The Revolutionary Guards to the terrorist list.
Yes.
And Iran is threatening to retaliate. Just exactly what sort of retaliation Iran is thinking of, I don't know. But the relationship between Iran and the US still seems to be as bad as ever.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, there is not an American ambassador in Tehran. Is that correct?
No.
So we have no diplomatic relations with them at all. And I had thought that we were on the path to possibly seeing some normalization on the horizon somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, and it's very unfortunate because Iran is actually the most, what shall I say, scientifically advanced country in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And America should be collaborating with them, and they should be collaborating with America, whereas Saudi Arabia is in fact guilty of all sorts of things that America should be trying to stop.
It's a terrible situation. But
organization is the problem in the modern world, I'm afraid.
Organization remains the problem, and we remain optimistic jointly. All right, Professor.
So we'll see what happens in the next week.
Until next week, thank you.